Good morning. The last few entries, I've been presenting some of Mathew Franklin Whittier's methods of using code, of embedding coded or secret information in his written materials. And the one that I focused on is where he would arrange with the editors, seemingly, to have his various pieces under different pseudonyms, or sometimes he would bring in somebody else's poetry, for example, and have them appear directly one above the other or side by side on the page in such a way that, for example, the poem would tell you what the secret topic was in the prose piece. So that's just one technique that he used. He used several. One of my favorites is that he would quote a piece of poetry, for example, and it would just seem to have the usual supportive import. But then if you looked up the quote, you would find that the secret message was in the stanza before or the stanza afterwards. See, in other words, it was in the context of the quote, and you had to look it up. Well, that's so much easier now with the internet. I don't have the scholarship that Mathew had, which would have been required to, know where these quotes came from. He apparently was very widely read. And thank God I have the internet now, because I never could catch up to the scholarship that he'd spent a whole lifetime gathering. But that particular technique I can't illustrate without getting into my major topics that each of my 4 papers is going to be on. So I'm not going to delve into that one today because I don't want to scoop my own papers. However, there's other techniques he used, and my purpose today is just to show that this is beyond chance, that Mathew really did embed secret messages in his pieces. Because the skeptical objection is naturally going to be, that's coincidence, and you're just imagining it and so forth. So I want to establish the kind of code that Mathew used. Skeptics, cynics, at any rate, if not skeptics, never can be convinced by anything. If all else fails, they'll bug out and just say, well, you've talked enough, as I've said, my favorite excuse. Well, I'm going to end this conversation now. This is ridiculous, Well, it's because you're getting too close to home, see, and they can't deal with it. They can't argue with you anymore, so they bug out. Well, that's okay. It's human nature, ego defense mechanisms. Everybody uses them gradually over lifetimes. I think we learn not to, but be that as it may. At any rate, I'm going to share some of these things, and I think they're fascinating. Mathew primarily used these techniques when there was something he really wanted to tell posterity, and usually it had to do with his authorship. I should go back and mention that when I first got hold of Mathew's work, because we're talking like a month or 2 after I first found Mathew online, I found out that there was a student thesis, his only full-length biography by William Lloyd Griffin. It was published in 1941. I got hold of it through interlibrary loan. And in the back, in the appendix, were 4 or 5 of his Ethan Spike stories, the only pseudonym, the only series that historians credit him with. And the only reason that ever became known is that he was outed. In 1857, apparently, he was exposed as the author of Ethan Spike. Up to that point, nobody knew. So when we get into Ethan Spike here, before 1857, nobody knew that that's who he was. Afterwards, they did. So as soon as I got hold of some of these examples of Ethan Spike, immediately the impression came to me. I said, oh, he used to embed secret code about his own personal life into these stories. And I hadn't seen any examples of it. I had no reason to say that, but it turned out to be true with bells on. And it's very evidential, actually. It's a little thing, but it's a strong piece of evidence. Anyway, I'm going to give some examples of that. And I have antiquarian originals of everything, I think, here today. So I'll put my keyboard over here. We're going to be a little informal because I'm handling these huge volumes and there's no way to do it gracefully. So the first one we're going to look at is the Portland transcript of September 26, 1857. This would have been 2-3 months after he was exposed as Ethan Spike. I don't think that's particularly relevant here, but that's the case. And This is the 1857 Portland transcript, and we're going to open to September 26, 1857. This is a story entitled, it's a letter from Ethan Spike, so it doesn't have a title, but it's about picnics. It's about a town picnic. And the premise of this is that the little town of Hornby has a town picnic, and it's a lot of young people, and the testosterone hormones are running high. And there's these two chaperones, these very stodgy chaperones that make sure everybody behaves themselves. So Matthew has a lot of fun with this. I feel and think that this goes back to a time when Mathew and Abby would go on private picnics, much as you see in Lady Geraldine's Courtship, which Mathew was the original author of and not Elizabeth Barrett Browning. And when they became sexually active, they would make love on these picnics, or at least mess around anyway. So apparently they got caught, or they got ratted on or something. And as near as I can tell from a lot of clues embedded in Mathew's writing and my own past life memory, they were separated for a pretty long time where they weren't even allowed to correspond. So it was a mess. So Mathew communicated to her through his published works, see? That's what I have extrapolated. But in the meantime, Mathew, many years later, after Abby's death, is writing about this, and he's embedding it in code. So we have the picnic. Well, this is supposed to be a town picnic. And we have the chaperones and so forth and so on. It's actually rather amusing. I think it's a pretty good piece. But down at the bottom, the minister is going to preach on it. Elder Fossil, Fawsill, which is pretty obvious reference. It's a reference to him being old, but it's also a reference to traditional religion being hidebound and fossilized. See, so there's a deeper philosophical message, as Mathew always has. So here we say, and it's in accent, which I can't do the accent, but there most likely will have to be a town meeting on it yet, though there is some talk of Elder Fossils going to preach about it from the 7th chapter, 42nd verse of the first book of Nicodemus. And here's the quote: "Them that sins in a corner shall be winked at, but them that go again public opinion can't go to heaven at any price." Well, the real persecution was against Abby as a witch, see, because of her interest in the occult, and against Mathew for being her boyfriend. And this was an excuse to come down on them, see. But they were shunned. So the instant I looked at this, I said, this is code. I felt it, you know. And, well, there's no book of Nicodemus, you know, Nicodemus. He calls him Nicodemus. But immediately it came to me, well, that's got to be Nostradamus. And in a talk I gave about this, I asked the audience, who do you think this is? And one lady immediately came up and said, that's Nostradamus. So it's not just me. Well, it so happens that there is not a 7th chapter, but a 7th century in Nostradamus. And there is a 42nd verse, the very last verse. And it reads, "Two newly arrived have seized the poison to pour it in the kitchen of the great prince. By the scullion, both are caught in the act. Taken he who thought to trouble the elder with death." So that's Mathew's humorous reference to Abby's father, the Marquis, who didn't approve of their relationship and who prohibited them from marrying eventually, and they had to elope. But apparently they were making out in the kitchen and got caught. So this is Mathew's, you know, way of using code to relate intimate details, see, about his relationship with Abby. He could never come out and write. It may be in a diary somewhere, but he couldn't come out and write, we made out on picnics and got caught, and we got caught making out in the kitchen, and I was prevented, you know, from seeing her. So he puts it in code in little bits and pieces. So I don't think that that's much speculation there, you know, with all of the evidence in. And I have a lot more evidence I could bring to bear on that. I don't think there's a lot of speculation going on there. That's clearly what he was doing, you know, but for fun. But let's move into some of these examples where he's trying to tell us that he was the real author of some particular piece, which was being claimed by somebody else. And we're not going to go into the famous ones. I have a lot of evidence like this regarding Edgar Allan Poe and the Raven and Matthew. I'm not going to bring that in because I don't want to scoop my own paper. But from the fall of 1849 until mid-1852, Matthew was writing a travelogue for the Boston Weekly Museum under the pseudonym Quails. Well, Matthew had been raised Quaker. Quakers were called shaken Quakers, and so that probably is part of the reference. Who knows? But anyway, he was traveling apparently as a postal inspector through the New England states, and he would report on his travels. He took the persona of an old man, even though he wasn't old. He was in his, late 30s and early 40s, roughly, at that time. So he took the persona of an old man who was traveling for the government, and he would never say in what capacity. Whereas Quails was a man perpetually in grief for his soulmate who felt old and knew that he was an old soul and was traveling around as a postal inspector for the government. So it wasn't too far off. But here's the thing. He was, during this period, doing some very touchy anti-slavery work. He was an anti-slavery agent. Apparently, he was working as a liaison for William Lloyd Garrison, and apparently he was reporting his contacts through this travelogue. So he would meet, but for example, he would meet with an abolitionist, but he would never say anything about abolitionism. He would just talk about meeting him and what an interesting house he had built for himself and stuff like that. Or he met with Daniel Webster not long after the Fugitive Slave Act was passed into law, and they only talk about looking at Webster's fruit trees and that they both had coals. And one little sentence talks about that they talked about national fairs. So all that column was designed to do was to report his contacts, that they were successfully made. Never anything about the content. So Matthew, during a certain period, seems to have been traveling with an entertainer named Ossian Dodge. I think he was ghostwriting for him because Matthew did ghostwrite. He was a humorist. I think he was ghostwriting Ossian Dodge's routines. And as a result, they would travel. I know they were friends for a certain period of time because in one of his pseudonyms, Matthew has his character meeting and becoming friends with Dodge. So one of the other contributors to the paper got it in her head that the writer of Quails must be Ossian Dodge because she compared the itinerary, Dodge's performance itinerary with Quails's reported itinerary, and saw that they lined up, and she made the mistaken assumption that Quails was really Ossian Dodge. And then Dodge started inferring that it was, and the editor, who was a conservative, both of these were actually conservatives, racists. Matthew didn't realize it as regards Dodge at first. The editor, Charles A.B. Putnam, started hinting that Dodge was Quails. Or Quails was Dodge. And it stuck. Eventually, toward the end of that paper, before Dodge bought it out, because he became the next owner of that paper, the editor, Charles Putnam, was saying in black and white that Ossian Dodge had been writing as Quails. See? And historians ate it up. Historians apparently are so gullible. They buy all this stuff, they don't question any of these things. They don't question the fact that this was brilliantly written, that it was written by clearly a liberal, and Dodge was a conservative, which you can see when he takes over the paper, you can see, what his proclivities are. And he had never written anything before. He couldn't even write his own songs. He had to advertise and have contests. He had plenty of money. He was like a rock star. So he would advertise a contest, and then he would take the best one and make that his song. He couldn't even write his own material, no less write something as sophisticated as this travelogue. And yet historians have bought it, hook, line, and sinker. It's the same with Charles Dickens and A Christmas Carol. It's the same, especially with Edgar Allan Poe and The Raven. Edgar Allan Poe couldn't possibly have written The Raven. He didn't have that ability to write like that, nor the sensibilities, nor the morality and the ethics and the spirituality. He just didn't have it. So anyway, we're going to stick with the non-famous ones. And what we're going to look at is a very interesting entry, which gave me the fits. I kept running into these apparent contraindications that disproved my theory altogether. And then I would find clue after clue after clue that Mathew Franklin Whittier was the real author. And then I'd come up against this strong contraindication. Well, Mathew was covering his tracks. He was deepening his cover. He did not want to be discovered as the real author of Quails because he was using it to report back to William Lloyd Garrison to report his contacts. So he had to stay undercover, and he was willing to let people think that Ashen Dodge was the author to deepen his cover. So in the November 9, 1850 edition, Quails actually goes to the extent of claiming Ashen Dodge's own birthday. He plays along with it. He pretends to be Ashen Dodge and claims Dodge's birthday. It's bizarre. And yet he leaves a clue. This is the 1850. He leaves a clue that it's him for posterity because he doesn't want posterity to be fooled by it, which means I had to reincarnate to set this straight, which again, I think is kind of interesting. People would think it was interesting if they believed me. They just plain don't believe me, that's all. I'm going to lower this light a little bit so that I can see better what I'm doing. You're going to see it on the screen a lot more clearly. Sometimes I'll read things wrong, and you'll see that I've made a mistake on the screen as you follow along with the close-up. Well, that's because I don't see it nearly as clearly as what you do on the screen. All right, here we go. This, as I said, it's in the November 9, 1850 edition, but he's signing it October 28, 1850. And let's see. He says, now we haven't the slightest suspicion that the above date, he gives the date of Tuesday, the 22nd of October. That is Ashen Dodge's birthday. Then he says, now we haven't the slightest suspicion that the above date, even in big figures, would cause any particular sensations within your breast. But we have always been in the habit of commencing the new year on the ever to be remembered, by ourselves, of course, nobody else would ever think of the thing, glorious 22nd day of October. It was at 8 o'clock on the morning of that eventful day that Quails was first introduced into society. So he's telling the readership that he's Ashen Dodge. I would be interested to know what time of day that Mathew was born, because he may have given his own birth time, but it's not recorded so far as I know. If it ever comes up, it'd be interesting to find out which of them was actually born at 8 o'clock in the morning. I think it's code, and I'm guessing that was actually the time that Mathew was born. So he says, and strange to say, the kind-hearted nurse who officiated as cicerone on the occasion, and who had been the mother of 9 little cherubs, calmly and distinctly expressed her firm conviction from the appearance of the little towhead before her that we were yet destined to become, quote, some pumpkins, if not more. Now, that was one of Mathew's favorite phrases. It derived from his early nickname, Peter Pumpkin, which I've talked about many times. So that was an expression that meant like a pistol, see some pumpkins. Well, that's the description of Mathew, not of Ashen Dodge. He used it many, many times. I could tell you on the screen, and I will look it up after this is over, how many times Mathew used the expression some pumpkins in his work. So he's pretending to be Ashen Dodge and to have Ashen Dodge's birthday, but he's leaving us clues that it's really him. Now, not long after that, he leaves us a big whopping clue, just in case people in the future didn't get it that time. So that we move forward now to the December 7th, 1850 edition. Quails writes again. He writes quite regularly in this paper. And here he is going to visit Edwin Plummer, who is the editor of the Eclectic, I believe it is, in Portland. Now, he keeps a home base in Portland, even though he lives in Boston and travels around, because his second family He's estranged from his second wife that was an arranged marriage, Jane Vaughan, but still he has children, and he visits them, and he maintains the family in Portland. And this is important because if you read Matthew's biography, Griffin's thesis, you'll see Griffin believing that Mathew abandoned his family. Well, he did no such thing. They actually split up in 1849, not in 1857, and Mathew continued to support them from New York or wherever he was working. So here he decides, since he's in Portland, he wants to visit Ethan Spike. Now this is 1850. Nobody has any idea that Mathew is the author of Ethan Spike. But Mathew is probably thinking to himself, someday it will be known, see? So he has one of his characters visit the other one. You know, I could go on with that, but that's the gist of it, is that he has signed Quails as Mathew by having him visit Ethan Spike. So that's just some of the ways that Mathew would use code. I'm going to put this over here and grab my notes. But there's another really interesting example of this. Now, I have to give a little background, and I've mentioned this before recently. I don't know how many people watching this have seen previous entries, so I have to recap. Abby died in 1841. In 1849, Mathew had been, for about a year, had been contributing heavily to this Boston Weekly Museum. And he started sending in Abby's work, stories and a couple poems and one essay, publishing them posthumously for her. But he didn't tell the editor, apparently, that it was him sending these in. He pretended that AP was a living person who lived in Worcester, Massachusetts. So he would send these things in and they would get published. The first one, entitled Mary Mahoney, was signed AP, which was Abby's maiden initials, Abby Poyen. It's a long story about that because her classroom teacher in 1830, Albert Pike, the future Southern Civil War general and leader of the Masons, stole her poetry and claimed it for himself. So there's a lot of her poetry signed AP, which was not really Albert Pike, it was Abby Poyen. And then he modified it and messed with it, and it's a mess. So that's a whole other subject. But here, AP can't possibly be Albert Pike for a number of reasons. It's definitely either Abby or somebody else, which I've basically disproven that the likelihood of it being somebody else is about zero because there's so many specific indicators pointing to Abby. So this is Abby's work submitted by Mathew, and that's in 1849, 1850. And then comes one of these whoppers of a seeming contraindication. I thought I had lost it. I thought, this is somebody else. It's not Abby, somebody that actually lives in Worcester, Mass. And the reason for that is that AP writes to the editor, sends in 2 letters to the editor. And the second one is on July 26, 1850. Now, I looked at these more closely. I said, wait a minute, and I looked at them and they're full of clues. Both of them are heavily saturated with clues, which tell us that Mathew was writing in character as Abby. It's quite possible he conceives of himself as channeling her. I can't prove that one way or the other, but he's certainly writing in character as her. And he loads these letters up with clues. I can't go through all of them. I'm just going to show you a couple. So let's see. This is in the 1851 Boston Weekly Museum. I think you can maybe get a look at the spine on this one. There it is, Boston Museum. See? And we're going to go to the July 26, 1851 edition. Try not to hit the computer this time. As I said, this has to be kind of informal because these things are so bulky. And let's see where it is now. Here it is over here, all the way on the right. I'm going to move my table over. And it's under original correspondence from Worcester. It's spelled W-O-R-C-E-S-T-E-R, Cester. If you're in the know around here, you know that that's pronounced Worcester, but the locals pronounce it Worcester. So this is Worcester. July 17th, 1851 is when she's supposedly writing. That's the day before Matthew's birthday, actually, which I hadn't thought about, but that's kind of interesting. I don't know if it's relevant or not, but that's the day before Matthew's birthday. So it's as though she's channeling with Matthew for his birthday, But anyway, here she writes, well, before I start reading it, in the first paragraph, there are 4 capitalized references to heaven. So Matthew is telling us this is somebody who's in heaven. Okay, 4 different ways of saying heaven, and they're all capitalized. And it's not an accident, I'm telling you. Best museum. Did you ever visit Happy Valley? A contemptuous look I see, as though our good, pleasant museum did not go all over the world, and as though there could be a valley at all visited by the same museum that was not a happy valley. Oh, the egotism of these times. I was questioning of the so-called Happy Valley, a haunt in old Leominster that is so peaceful and Eden-like, capital E. If the non-resistants should encamp there, I am sure they would go distracted for want of something they could shun resisting. The fields are wonderfully smooth and green, the landscapes picturesque, wooded hills on every side would remind you of pictures of old Rhine scenery, and the small stream that winds through it is as smooth and glassy as could have been either of the 4 rivers of Eden. There we have Eden again. But what would impress you most of this little paradise, capital P, is its perfect peace. Not a leaf appears to be ruffled by the breeze. The tree boughs wave to and fro, stilly and slowly, as though afraid of disturbing the all-pervading calm, and the birds that chirp there seem to me not like other birds, or rather the same birds elsewhere, but of softer notes, and wings that skim the air with freer grace, just as though the valley atmosphere had brought them nearer heaven, capital H. That's 4 capitalized references to heaven. Okay? And it goes on. And here's another one. I'll continue with the second paragraph. So it strikes the eye, a sort of mimic Kashmir in the summertime, bringing to one's mind that far-off Eden of which George Thompson left us Worcester people so glowing a description. George Thompson, there, I see I have offended. Hey-ho, our museum takes umbrage at that name, and his meek little admirer finds her ears tingling with a terrible reprimand. That means that this is a woman, not a man, by the way. Don't trouble yourself any farther to give it, Mr. Editor. She hears it all the way from Boston, alas, for this era of clairvoyance and speedy traveling. Well, clairvoyance and speedy traveling means in the astral realm, and that she hears it means that from the astral realm she knows his thoughts. But George Thompson, that's the British abolitionist, and actually he was well known to the Whittier family, and I think that it appears from Elizabeth Whittier's diary, Matthew's little sister, that she kind of had a crush on him, see? So he was well known to them. Well, I know that Charles A.B. Putnam, the editor, was a racist, but he didn't make it really obvious. How would little A.P. from Worcester, who had just submitted work to this paper, how would she know he was a racist? Well, she knew because she's in the astral realm, but Mathew knew. See, Mathew, writing for her in character as Abby, knew very well that Charles A.B. Putnam was a racist. See? So otherwise, it couldn't be just anybody who lived in Worcester. How would she know? So we know it's not Albert Pike, and we know that it's not some other person, other than Abby. And there's a whole bunch of clues that it's Abby in the astral realm who has clairvoyance and knows his thoughts and, is in heaven or Eden or paradise. So that's an example of the ways that Mathew would use code. Both of these letters are just full of code. I could just go through them and point out things, and I might even catch things I hadn't seen before. It's so full of coded references. But again, those are just examples. When I release my paper about Edgar Allan Poe and Mathew Franklin Whittier and The Raven, I'm going to rely fairly heavily on Mathew's coded references. There's no question whatsoever that if these are in fact coded references and not coincidences that I'm reading meaning into, if it's real, that Mathew definitely said several times over that Edgar Allan Poe was a phony, he was an imposter, he couldn't possibly have written The Raven, and he stole it from Mathew, and he was unscrupulous, basically sociopathic personality. All that is more or less in code in Mathew's writing. And all of that is under pseudonyms. None of it, of course, is under Mathew's name. So that means I have to first identify Mathew as the author. And secondly, I have to recognize and decode Mathew's coded messages, But before I do any of that, I have to show that he actually did use coded messages, and this isn't just my imagination. So that, I think, in the last 3-4 entries I have done. I don't think there's any question from anybody who's objective that Mathew did indeed embed these messages in his works. So when I get to Edgar Allan Poe, and later on I get to the other people, famous people that plagiarized Mathew, which is Elizabeth Barrett Browning and Margaret Fuller, and I bring up some of these, you'll know that there's a whole bunch of examples of Mathew doing this. And again, remember, this is something I felt immediately upon looking at Mathew's Ethan Spike stories a couple months or so after I first found him. I knew immediately that he did that before I'd even found any examples. So again, that's pretty strong. I mean, that's a pretty strongly verified past life memory if he really did that, because, everybody writes autobiographically to an extent, but not everybody embeds these specific, detailed, coded messages in their work like that. Some people do, I think. I don't think Mathew was the only one who did that, but he did it with bells on. And for me to remember that just by holding these things in my hand, and suddenly that comes to me, that impression, of course it would if I was Mathew, because it was a big deal for Mathew to do that. And emotionally, I would remember it. So there we go. I won't make this any longer. This is like a little over half an hour. I'm trying to keep them a little bit short, so we at least get 2 or 3 people looking. I'm doing all, it was like 3 hours of preparation for this. And then like 3 people watch. It's 1 person per hour of preparation, But there'll be more in the future, I'm quite sure. And thank you for watching.